So just a little bit of a warning, kind of how I'm going to go at this. We're used to thinking of Jeffers as somebody who says, love nature, not man. And we tend to think of in Jeffers' work, the human realm and the natural realm are separate. And we should align with the one and move away from the other. I'm not sure it's quite that simple. And I think when we recover something about the original history and shaping of the Tamar collection, we see that other angle. And I want to share that other angle with you tonight, not to deny the other dimension of it, but to, I hope, enhance it, if that seems okay. And the other thing I want to, of course, do is say thank you to the Book Club of California for setting this up, for Kevin and Jacob and the staff for all of their help. And actually, I'm going to start this by talking about the Book Club of California. So if you are a member, thank you, Book Club of California. Toward the end of 1923, an unknown poet from some place called Carmel by the Sea saw an ad in the New York Times and decided to pay a printer to publish a book of poems that he believed, probably rightly so, no commercial publisher would touch. The printer was so taken with the collection that he sent out review copies at his own expense, but with no results. And after some months, the book was well on its way to the oblivion that is the usual fate of such self-published projects. And were it not for the Book Club of California, that would probably be the end of the story. Such writers as William Faulkner, Eugene O'Neill, John Steinbeck, Edward Abbey, Charles Bukowski, Ursula Le Guin, and others would not have been inspired by Jeffers' work. And the tradition of poetry of the American West and tradition of environmental literature would be without this foundational figure. And we wouldn't be here today marking the centennial of this collection. In the May 1932 issue of the Colophon, Jeffers tells the story of how Tamar came to be belatedly discovered. After the efforts of the printer Peter Boyle had hit a dead end, he explains, meanwhile, the Book Club of California was preparing an anthology of verse by California writers, afterwards called Continent's End. George Sterling, the California Bohemian poet, James Rorty and Genevieve Taggart were the editors. Someone having perhaps heard of my Macmillan volume, the 1916 collection Californians, told them that I also wrote verses, and a letter came from Rorty asking me to contribute. I sent some pages of verse, and when Tamar was printed, I mailed a copy to Rorty because of our correspondence, and one to George Sterling because he had lived in Carmel before my time and knew the scenes of my stories. What Jeffers doesn't note here is that Rorty, Sterling, and Taggart had been so impressed with the verses he'd submitted, they used one as the anthology's title poem, the crucial poem, Continent's End. And Rorty was also clearly sufficiently impressed by these verses that he took the time to read Tamar and Other Poems when it arrived, and was then so impressed that he wrote a rave review in the Herald Tribune, and so impressed that he recommended Tamar to Mark Van Doren, a poet and man of letters, who reviewed it in The Nation, and to the poet Babette Deutsch, who reviewed it in the New Republic. And these three reviews all appeared in May 1925. And they transformed Jeffers from an unknown poet from the hinterlands into a major poet. And this in turn led to Boney and Liveright, at the time an important literary publisher, reissuing the Tamar collection in November 10th, 1925, as the concluding section of an expanded volume called Roan Stallion, Tamar, and Other Poems, which would remain in print for decades, and then in 1935 become one of the first contemporary titles in the Random House Modern Library series. So, had Jeffers not moved to Carmel, had someone that he met there not mentioned Californians to George Sterling, had Sterling not been one of the editors enlisted by the Book Club of California, had Rorty not had the connections to launch the collection, odds are Tamar would never have been reviewed, and Jeffers might well have continued to add poems to the stack in the desk drawer on the chance they might be belatedly discovered, as the poems of Emily Dickinson were after her death. But more likely, he would be known only to a few Carmel locals as that weird person who built that odd stone cottage on the headland with stone tower next to it. And maybe also to a few residents, a few readers rather, of California poetry who happened across a book club of California anthology published a century ago. So on behalf of all of us who care about Jeffers' work, thank you, Book Club of California. Okay, now, bravo, yes. So I want to turn now to Babette, a little bit of Babette Deutsch's review, but I want to share with you first the opening of the poem Tamar, the narrative, because this is what opened the collection. So this is the first thing that would have struck Babette Deutsch's eye. And think of how different this would be from opening T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, or Ezra Pound's poetry, or William Stevens, or I'm sorry, Wallace Stevens or William Carlos Williams in this same era. This is different. A night the half moon was like a dancing girl, no, like a drunkard's last $50 shoved on the polished bar of the Eastern Hill Range. Young Caldwell rode his pony along the sea cliff. When she stopped, spurred. When she trembled, drove the teeth of the little jagged wheels so deep they tasted blood. The mare, with 4 slim hooves on a foot of ground, pivoted like a top, jumped from the crumble of sod, went down, caught, slipped, then the quick frenzy finished, stiffening herself, slid with her drunken rider down the ledges, shot from the sheer rock, and broke her life out on the rounded tidal boulders. The night, you know, accepted with no show of emotion. The little accident, grave Orion, moved northward from the naked shore. The moon moved to meridian. Okay, it is not T.S. Eliot. All right. Something of the impact of Tamar and other poems when it was first discovered and read can be glimpsed in Babette Deutsch's laudatory review. Her opening remarks make it clear that she found Jeffers' poetry utterly unique and deeply powerful, so completely unlike the work of other contemporary American poets that only classical Greek poetry offered a point of comparison. Her review opens. In Robinson Jeffers, we find a poet concerned, like John Muir, with the cosmos, in which man is but a momentary flicker. But the magnificent strophes of this strangely obscure poet show a richer maturity. This reviewer reading Jeffers felt somewhat as Keats professed to feel on looking into Chapman's Homer. Nothing is discoverable of the man save that he lives on the Pacific coast and was published by a New York linotyper, Peter Boyle, whose name should go down laureled in the annals of American literature. The opening poem, Tamar, is a powerful dramatic narrative on the stern Greek model, given a native setting and written in free verse that has in it the long roll and swing of the elder seas. Jeffers has his own style, which is worthy of his high moods and gnarled thinking, for there is thinking in these lyrics which lift them onto the plane of great writing. It is possible not to share the Oriental philosophy expressed in some of these poems, but it is impossible to have strong poetry without the force of some equal conviction beating like a heart in its body. Now, tell me any poet who didn't have a reputation who wouldn't just be totally thrilled having that review show up in the mail. Okay. So now we'll move more on to Jeffers. I was just trying to kind of do a little scene setting there. Today, we seldom think of Tamar and Other Poems. Apart from Roan Stallion and Tamar and Other Poems, and it's certainly the case that the Boney and Liveright publication of the expanded collection helped consolidate Jeffers' status as a major poet by generating a renewed wave of reviews and expanding his audience through its distributional clout. But the focus this created on the expanded collection, coupled with the scarcity of the privately printed Tamar and Other Poems, and the decision to place the Tamar material after the Roan Stallion material, has meant that Tamar as a collection in its own right essentially disappeared. And this has contributed to the impression that the Tamar material and the Ronstallion material are a single phase of work expressing a single unified vision. And it has contributed to the view that the collection is a work of the mid-1920s in which Jeffers offers a retreat to nature as an alternative to the frenetic hedonism and spiritual emptiness of post-World War I society, the so-called Roaring Twenties of the so-called lost generation. When we read the Tamar poems as a continuation of the Ronstallion work, as we typically do, we are apt to imagine that Jeffers experienced the trauma of World War I, resolved his responses to it, and then went on to write Tamar, Tower Beyond Tragedy, and Ronstallion, the three long poems which present nature as a transcendent alternative to human self-absorption and the emptiness of contemporary civilization. Yet, the Tamar poems were written from 1917 to 1923, while the Ronstallion poems date from 1924 to 1925. And when we read the Tamar work separately from the Ronstallion work, as that is a work leading to the Ronstallion material rather than continuing it, we discover that the Tamar poems, not only the earliest of them which explicitly reference the war, but those of the early 1920s which instead focus on nature, are shaped by the war's trauma and show Jeffers engaging this trauma rather than having moved beyond it. So I'm interested in, here's our centennial occasion. We pick up Ronstallion or Tamar as actually having been a book in its own right, and it pivots us back toward World War I, and it gives us a slightly different angle of perspective on his work. That's what I want to try to develop a little bit here. This centennial occasion challenges us to recover Tamar and Other Poems as a collection in its own right, one that leads to and helps inform the Ronstallion work, but also differs from the Ronstallion work. And if Ronstallion, Tamar, and Other Poems might be said to be the Jeffers Bible, in the sense of being his most comprehensive and foundational collection, then Ronstallion is the New Testament of nature. And the work Jeffers so painstakingly culled and organized into Tamar and Other Poems can be seen as the Old Testament of war. And while this metaphor is probably overly figural and fanciful, it suggests that considering Tamar as a separate collection has something to teach us about how Jeffers responded to World War I. Specifically, Tamar and Other Poems, especially if we explore it through the various ways Jeffers structured the collection before settling on its final version that Peter Boyle printed, can help us see how the impact of the Great War resonates throughout the Tamar poems, and how this not only impelled Jeffers to turn to nature for meaning and solace, but also helped shape a radically new vision of nature that we find in his major poetry. A new vision that is central to his poetry's significance and a fundamental part of the imaginative power of these poems. Okay, so we're going to get a little more technical now, sorry. Robinson Jeffers began writing Tamar, his first major narrative, in the spring of 1922. Probably finished it toward the end of that year, maybe early 23. In late summer of 1923 or early fall, he contracted Boyle to print the collection, then seems to have delayed sending it to be printed until early 1924. And all the way through that, he's trying out different organizations, putting poems in, taking poems out, swapping poems around, and revising poems, so that how the poems read in their first draft is often different than how they read after he revised them, having written Tamar. I will not bore you with all of those steps, by the way. That's another matter. We can link up privately by Zoom and I'll bore you with that. Okay, so while the surviving evidence does not allow us to recover each plan Jeffers considered for the collection, his revisions to the various poems, several draft introductions, and an early table of contents show that he experimented with which poems to include especially which poems from 1917 to 1919, and how to sequence them. The evidence suggests that his first impulse was to use World War I as a way to contextualize and justify the intense violence and startling transgressions of the narrative Tamar. And his final revisions to a little poem called Brides of the South Wind, an unpublished poem from 1920, makes the connection to World War I explicit. And before I turn to that, you'll notice in this table of contents, the poems that are lined out, Dance of the Banner, Mermat's Landing, Beginning of Decadence, those are poems that he did not include in the published Tamar. And notice he actually pulls the very famous poem, Shine, Perishing Republic, out of the collection and doesn't include it. He then reinserts it as part of the Roan Stallion material. Okay. The next little batch below that, those 6 poems are other early 1917 to, well, 1920, early, mid-1920 poems that he did eventually include in Tamar. And then the very bottom list are 3 poems that he finished after writing the narrative that ultimately end up in the collection. So the which poems he swapped in and out from the 1917-1920 period radically alter the way he presents his relationship to the war. I'm going to ask you just to sort of take that for granted for the moment, if you will indulge me in that. So now back to Brides of the South Wind, rather. A note on the manuscript of Brides of the South Wind shows that he reworked the poem after completing the narrative Tamar, and that he planned to use it as the opening poem in what was probably the first construction of the collection. In this revision, Jeffers adds Tamar to his list of heroines of other narratives, along with Fauna and Piso Feral from the transitional narratives Fauna and the Coast Range Christ. The list shows that this construction of the collection would have featured 3 long narratives. In spite of the differences in their narrative situations and versification, the 3 poems for Jeffers have one thing in common. He says the heroines are all, quote, daughters of war. So he explicitly names Tamar as a daughter of the war. And then he, sorry, lost my place. And then he goes on and explains that they have been made by the war's tempest. And in the poem, he instructs them to ask the reader's pardon for their wildness. Jeffers' own stake in the destructive wildness of his heroines is evident in a curious detail from part 1 of the poem, where he enjoins these daughters to let your father alone, since he has eaten sufficient suffering or offerings. If we understand this, as I think we should, that the poet who has imagined the stories of Fauna, Peace, and Tamar is implicitly their father, then these 3 narratives are offerings to expiate the god of war in the hope of finding some degree of relief and peace. And the speaker's need is implicit in the way the image, quote, full of blood as the fields of Picard poppies, infuses even his perception of nature's beauty with the war. It is in this sense that Tamar is a daughter of war. She is a means to engage the war's tempest, which has continued to obsess Jeffers years after its conclusion. So we're now talking here early 1923. And this suggests her narrative, the narrative Tamar, is as much a process of expiation as it is an act of representation. As a side note, this would help explain the way Jeffers shifts at times from narrating Tamar's story to instead responding directly to it in the poem. One further aspect of the Brides of South Wind is worth noting. In part 2 of the poem, which Jeffers added after writing Tamar, it culminates in the image with the image of Earth's red fire veins. That's not a peaceful nature. That's an intense nature. And in this concluding section, the nature which expresses, quote, the one God is not only evident in the beauty of pelicans stringing northward, but also in human wildness. In Brides of the South Wind, the human wildness of the individual and the collective violence of war are coming to be seen as elements of nature, not elements opposed to nature. Okay, so now let's go on and talk a little about this table of contents. So this would be probably the second attempt to construct the collection. This table of contents, right after the Brides of the South War, let's see, where are we here? In this early iteration of the collection, the 6 poems following the narrative, the 6 poems following Tamar, are in chronological order, the order in which they were written, and they implicitly trace Jeffers' evolving response to the war. They progress from lamenting its destructiveness to an early attempt to understand his own relationship to it, then on to a poem reflecting his momentary hope that what he initially saw as the bursting forth of liberty in Russia with the Russian Revolution would give the war and history a progressive meaning, paired with a poem recognizing that this would not be so, the Murmansk Landing, and then finally to a poem acknowledging the decadence of Western social, cultural, and political order, which leads to the crucial pivot in this collection, which is Shine, Perishing Republic, which is to embrace nature's being and place the self within it. Once he's made that move and that pivot, then the remaining poems, which are all from the later period, are develop nature as an alternative to the war's violence and corruption, and culminates in Continent's End, written spring 1922, which was probably the last poem Jeffers wrote before he began writing the narrative Tamar. So interestingly, it ends the collection in every iteration that we know of, and it also was the poem that impelled this key narrative. This iteration of the collection dramatizes the impact of the war through the wildness of Tamar's career, the daughter of the war, then confronts the war itself, then builds in its final arc to Continent's End, where Jeffers projects a post-Christian vision of divinity, and God is understood as the ceaseless cycle of tides of fire, which is the underlying logic of all being, and also simultaneously God's own full awareness of his being expressed through the image of the eye that watched. If you want to understand Jeffers' cosmology, you go to that poem. It's key to everything else. In both this early iteration of the collection and the one actually published by Peter Boyle, Tamar opens the book, Continent's End ends the book, and implicitly the structure is circular. You build through Tamar to Continent's End, and Continent's End takes you back into Tamar. Okay. Now, the shorter poems Jeffers wrote from December 1920 up through Continent's End show him moving away from the more conventional view where nature is an expression of God to a more radical view where nature, both as process and materiality, is divinity. So we're moving away from Wordsworth, we're moving away from Emerson. Instead of nature is an expression of God through which we may know God, nature itself is God, and we are part of nature. It's a more radical version, and we'll see that as we go forward here. These shorter poems also show that his explorations of what might be termed the nature of nature was part of his process of working through the catastrophe of World War I. The contrast between how Jeffers imagines nature in the beginning of Decadence, a poem that he never published, written early spring 1920 in response to the Versailles peace negotiations, and how he imagines nature in natural music, written December 1920, illustrates this. There we go. In the beginning of Decadence, Jeffers rails at those who rapped the drums of battle and squeak in the pipes for a corrupt peace that would and eventually did betray the hopes of those who had been tricked into fighting and dying. The poem even expresses his dismay at the failure of the Russian Revolution to redeem history. And near its end, Jeffers retreats from this disaster of human collectivity to, quote, the hills and stone belts of my own house. Some of you have been to Tor House, you know exactly and literally what he is speaking of there. To the stone belts of my own house, where his casements open west over the salt water and south to the coast range brows. Here he can, he asserts, be free of the bondage of submitting men. While this is a retreat from the decadence of the communal world, it is not, as it would be later in Jeffers' work, a retreat into nature. It is instead a retreat into a kind of isolation, where nature is at best an ephemeral beauty rather than a realm of permanence and meaning. In the poem, Jeffers evokes the headlands, quote, gold-eyed poppies and blue-flamed lupin, but then observes that these will die in the sun glare. Nature's beauty is temporary and superficial. It is not an alternative to history's meaningless violence in this transitional moment. In the beginning of decadence, Jeffers treats the violence and despair of civilization, epitomized by World War I, as one realm of being, and offers his retreat to the stone belts of his house as another realm of being, one where the alternative to despair is a kind of stoic acceptance. But now he has to build up from that. In Natural Music, written some 8 months later, Jeffers projects a radically different view of nature. Nature is no longer simply a setting or fleeting adornment. Nature has become ultimate, its ultimate being, and thus as well the realm of meaning. So if you'll follow along with the poem. It seems kind of a little lighthearted thing, but there's a twist to it. The old voice of the ocean, the bird chatter of little rivers, winter has given them gold for silver, to stain their water, and bladed green for brown to line their banks. From different throats, intone one language. So I believe if we were strong enough to listen without divisions of desire and terror to the sun, to the storm of the sick nations, the rage of the hunger-smitten cities, those voices also would be found clean as a child's, or like some girl's breathing who dances alone by the ocean shore, dreaming of lovers. In natural music, nations are not social political entities within civilization. They are organic beings within nature's more comprehensive being. And this shifts World War I from having been a disastrous rupture of history to being a symptom of one of nature's elements. As a sickness, the war, in spite of its scale and devastation, is part of the natural order and a moment within nature's permanence. In natural music, nations, cities, individuals, both dancing and dreaming, oceans, rivers, are all organic beings that participate and contribute to nature's totality. They are aspects of a comprehensive being. They are different throats intoning the one language, which is nature. The challenge, though, is to be strong enough to accept violence, decay, death, including one's own, in order to recognize nature's being, and thus hear the one language, and thus to become as well one of the throats singing. Read in the context of Roan Stallion, Natural Music can seem simply another poem where Jeffers says, nature's beauty is better than the sickness of civilization. Read in the context of the early table of contents of Tamar, where it follows so soon after the beginning of decadence, the Murmansk Landing, and other World War I poems, we are more apt to notice the storm of the nations as Jeffers invoking and responding to specifically World War I. How and why this matters turns on the seemingly trivial word if in the 5th line, which reads, so I believe if we were strong enough to listen. If natural music were simply Jeffers declaring that nature's language is so all-encompassing that it transcends the storm of sick nations and makes sickness irrelevant, then the fifth line should open, "So I believe," or even "So I know." But opening the line with "So I believe if" shifts the poem from simply pronouncing a doctrine, which is often the way it's read, from pronouncing a doctrine to confessing how difficult it is to accept the horrific, senseless violence of the war as part of the vocabulary of nature's one language. So it turns the poem into more of a dramatic confrontation. The challenge in the poem, both for the poet creating it and for the reader, is not simply to recognize nature's being. The challenge is to be brave enough to confront one's own divisions of desire and terror in order to hear nature's own language, one language, in its fullness. In the opening lines of natural music, Jeffers celebrates the beauty of nature and the richness of nature's language. The need to acknowledge the war and its violence as part of nature's language shifts the poem from a celebration to a challenge, which leads in the second half of the poem, being cast in the subjunctive voice as an aspirational projection of faith, deepened by an awareness of the challenge of maintaining faith. Paradoxically, natural music proposes the truth of nature's one language while revealing that the speaker is struggling to be strong enough to fully embrace the truth he believes in, a split suggested by the way the speaker is, in effect, both the I who believes and yet still, in and through his humanity, one of the we needing to be stronger in order to be strong enough. In natural music, nature is not an alternative to World War I. Instead, nature offers a way to engage the trauma and accept it, so long as we can, that is, be strong enough to see and listen without divisions of desire and terror. So what we see here is that nature is not an alternative, an escape from human violence. Human violence impels a vision of nature which has to incorporate violence within it. So it moves Jeffers' sense of nature into a slightly more challenging realm, I think. The crucial if in natural music disrupts our usual account of Jeffers' development, in which he moves beyond the crisis of the war once he discovers nature's beauty and permanence as an alternative to civilization's transitory ills sometime in 1919, perhaps in part through participating in building Tor House. Instead, natural music suggests that he incorporated the crisis of the war into his understanding of nature, and even that his understanding of nature was impelled by the war's violence. Here it's useful to consider a poem called The Daughter of God in Russia. What's that for a title? An unpublished poem from May 1918 that Jeffers wrote in response to the Russian Revolution. In the poem, which was first titled Liberty Stands in Russia, Jeffers celebrates the revolution as the rebirth of liberty and imagines this as history's purpose for World War I. In the poem, liberty is God's daughter. Her divine trait is unfettered energy, and she drives the destruction of the corrupt old order so that the world can be renewed. In this reconfiguring of the divine order, liberty supplants the Son of God, whose doctrine of peace and forgiveness has led to the stagnated order that she, through the war, is destroying in order to renew the human realm. In the poem, God's daughter stands next to the Father's throne, while the rejected Son lurks in the background, downcast and irrelevant. And Jeffers makes the irrelevance explicit when he hails the daughter as, quote, the Christ of whom her prophets cried. The Christ of whom her prophets cried. And in the poem, the redemption she brings is not eternal life of the self beyond death, once offered by the Son, but the destruction of the abject self through the daughter's liberating violence, a transcendence, if you would like, through annihilation. Jeffers was not in a good place at this moment, which I see. In The Daughter of God, Jeffers proposes what amounts to a new covenant in which divine energy replaces divine order, and this deepens our understanding of his conceptual and psychological response to World War I. In one crucial interlude, the speaker prays to God's daughter, confessing that he is sour and corrupted, and petitioning her to destroy him in Christ's name, which is, of course, her name, by crushing his heart as a grape trampled underfoot, ere God himself destroy me for my fury of sacrilege. The sacrilege is unspecified, but the passage suggests it involves having taken the self as the locus of meaning, and thus having failed to accept the self's ultimate insignificance in the divine order of destruction and renewal. In the passage, the only way Jeffers can imagine being redeemed from this damnation of self-absorption is for the daughter to destroy his corrupted, civilized self, and he projects a post-Christian salvation in which the promise of eternal life of the self beyond death becomes a prayer for God to destroy the self beyond death, to destroy the self through its divine energy. Instead of life beyond death, through the grace of the Son, death beyond life through the violence of the daughter. Now, the reason I bring this up is not because that's where Jeffers stops, but if we think of the narrative Tamar, the daughter of God, liberty, prefigures the character of Tamar. Okay? So it's a later, that Tamar is an avatar of liberty, God's daughter. And it is in this sense also that she is a daughter of war. Even though her story occurs on the Big Sur coast, and the war seems simply a distant background. In her eventual destructive wildness, Tamar becomes liberty's agent, destroying to cleanse and renew, and as such, liberty, she who is Christ, acts through the human figure of Tamar. And this expands the implications of liberty beyond the allegory of daughter of God by treating nature rather than God the Father as the locus of divinity. Tamar transgresses sexual norms, discovers the house of Caldwell's corruption, plumbs the corruption, then transcends it by unleashing the destructive, cleansing and renewing energy of God's daughter in the conflagration that concludes the poem and becomes her own self-destruction. Recognizing that the figure of liberty in the daughter of God anticipates the figure of Tamar shows, I'd suggest, that Jeffers, in writing Tamar, was working out the implications of World War I for his understanding of nature and his relationship to it. And as such, the poem enacts divisions of desire and terror. It also moves beyond the daughter of God by affirming nature's music. And this is crucial, I'd suggest, to understanding how the traumatic violence of World War I impels Jeffers' vision of nature, and how this vision of nature both includes the war's violence and transcends it. And here I want to share with you the concluding passage to the narrative poem, Tamar. So at the end of the poem, she's managed to get everybody in the house of Caldwell, all gathered in the old farmhouse. She manages to get the house lit afire, and they're all burning up in this conflagration. So that's just kind of the cheery little setting for where this starts. And old Aunt Stella, through the opening door, ran into the red and black and did not scream any more. Then Tamar, did you think you would go laughing through France? She's saying this to her brother, who wanted to go off and join the war and party with the French ladies. And the old man, fierce light, have pity, Christ 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 have pity. And Tamar, with her back to the window, embraced her brother, who struggled toward it, but the floor turned like a wheel. Grass grows where the flame flowered, a hollowed lawn strewn with a few black stones, and the brick of broken chimneys. All about there, the old trees, some of them scarred with fire, endure the sea wind. And that's where the poem ends. Okay. Cheerful enough for you? There. Lost my place. Okay. If Tamar's story ended with the plot's final scene, where she embraces Lee in the midst of the flame as the floor turns like a wheel, so that neither she nor he can escape the fire, the daughter of God would not only be a precursor to Tamar, but an explanatory template for it. But this conflagration that consumes Tamar, her entourage, and the house of Caldwell is not the end of the poem. It simply ends the plot's action. It's the end of the story, but it's not the end of the poem. And it leads to the four-line coda: grass grows where the flame flowered, and the old trees, scarred with fire, endure the wind. After the plot's cathartic storm, this concluding evocation of nature's beauty is a welcome respite, right, from human perplexity and violence. But it's more than that. These four lines interweave, in a manner reminiscent of Whitman, different scales of time: the flash of fire, the life cycle of grass, the history of the house of Caldwell, reduced to broken chimneys, the more extended life cycle of the trees, and the expansive duration of the stones blackened by the fire, but essentially unchanged by it. These lines, that is, are not a scenic tableau as Jeffers brings the curtain down. They are an enactment of an awareness of time within time and time beyond time, coupled with a recognition of how change, including the destructive flowering of fire, marks this moment. Instead of a temporary respite of peace following violence, these concluding lines enact a visionary awareness of the fullness of nature's being, with change and violence, including human violence, as fundamental aspects of nature and within it. It is a naturalized expression, that is, of the cosmology of continent's end, the simultaneity of tides of fire and the eye that watched. Or to put it another way, in expressing the divinity of the daughter of God through Tamar as her agent, and immersing himself in the story he imagines for her, Jeffers enters the tides of fire and momentarily achieves something akin to the transcendent awareness of God's eye that watches, a transcendence he had not yet envisioned in 1918 in Daughter of God. And this transcendence moves beyond World War I, even as it draws from and contains its traumatic, destructive violence. Or at least this is so if we become strong enough to see without divisions of desire and terror. So Jeffers' vision of nature is not Wordsworth warmed over or updated. It is Wordsworth turned on its head. It's Wordsworth facing this disaster that we've been through. In closing, since you've been so patient, or maybe I put you all to sleep, I don't know. I'd like to make two final somewhat summarizing observations. First, part of what makes Roan Stallion, Tamar, and Other Poems so compelling as a collection is that it opens with two major long poems, Roan Stallion and Tower Beyond Tragedy, where Jeffers focused primarily on what might be termed our being within nature's being. In different ways, they invite us to climb what he imagines as the tower beyond tragedy by shifting our gaze from human affairs to nature's transhuman magnificence. And the narrative Tamar, opening the expanded collection's final section, can then seem a further expression of that vision. One of the values of recovering Tamar and Other Poems as a separate collection in its own right is that it deepens our understanding of how World War I, at least in part, impelled the development of Jeffers' vision of nature. And this can as well deepen our understanding of Jeffers' vision of nature. And it makes it, I think, more relevant to the multiple traumas that we are somehow trying to get through in the present moment: political, climatological, and so on. Second, in our literary histories, Roan Stallion, Tamar, and Other Poems is typically viewed as a mid-1920s book. Yet Jeffers was writing the narrative Tamar and most of the key shorter poems in the collection at the same time that his almost exact contemporaries T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were writing The Wasteland and the Mobberley poems. The stylistic, conceptual, and tonal differences between The Wasteland and Tamar are obvious, no doubt. Yet both powerfully document the impact of the so-called Great War. Both powerfully reflect on the cultural order the war had destroyed, and both profoundly register the religious vacuum the war created. Is Tamar and Other Poems perhaps richer for recovering this context? Is The Wasteland perhaps richer for being read in conjunction with Tamar? At the least, the juxtaposition of these two pivotal works calls attention to the contrasting conclusions. At the end of The Wasteland, we are left praying for a vision that would redeem us from the devastation. At the end of Tamar, we are offered a vision that reimagines the devastation as an aspect of a greater whole within the divinity of nature's being. Or we are, that is, if we are strong enough to listen without divisions of desire and terror to the storm of the sick nations and the rage of the hunger-smitten cities. And thank you very much for your patience.
Take a little drink there so we can answer some questions. Do we have any questions here in the club rooms that we want to start with? John.
Very simple. Talks about a book club. One of the things we know from the book club legend is Albert Bender.
Yes.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Albert Bender would go down to visit the storehouse,
Yes.
and his driver was a very young Anselides.
Yes.
And that's probably a more, where did Bender have anything to do with this business? Because he was kind of one of the presiding figures until his death in 41. And in the early 20s, he was really kind of like the treasurer when the Demiverse. Did he have anything to do with, let's say, the creation of Continents and that publication?
The question is whether Albert Bender had anything to do with the Continent's End volume. I don't know that he did. I'm sorry, I'm not enough of an expert. Bender, of course, was a benefactor of Jeffers over many years because Bender was quite wealthy. And for much of his career, the Jeffers were economically not plush. So some of the little luxury items that they would end up
Do you
with.
know when Bender would have met Jeffers?
I believe it would be at some time in the later 1920s.
That
But-
late?
I believe so, but again, I would have to go back to the letters. And here's where I'm at a bit of a loss in terms of really handling your question appropriately. My focus has been on the chronology and the story of the poems, and I've been a little less involved with the kind of the larger social, cultural, aesthetic community in which Jeffers moved. I am very aware of Bender's importance, but I don't know the details. If you have questions about those sorts of things, two sources that are really good would be the edition of Jeffers' correspondence that James Carman did for Stanford. And you can find Jim online, and he's a very generous soul. He's an old guy like me. And you can pitch that question to him and he would have absolutely every detail for you. So James Carman, the edition of letters that Jim did.
I thought you were saying there were two sources.
Right. One is the edition of letters that James Carman edited, and then Jim himself. Yeah.
Another question here. Paul.
What is Jeffers' personal experience from World War I?
Conflicted. He was not in the war. He was not in Europe. As a early teen, his father sent him to European boarding schools in Switzerland because his father wanted him to learn languages. So as soon as he would learn one language, he'd move him to another part of Switzerland to learn another language. It's a great way to make friends. But Jeffers had a fairly robust experience of European culture. He'd lived in Austria for a while. So he was certainly aware of the devastation of the European cultural order with the war. And he had the sense of, oh, I want to go fight as so many young romantic men did. He had two young sons that were twins, and his wife was saying, the hell you're going to go. You know, you stay here. I need you here, you jerk. So there was a lot of conflict between the two of them. They finally compromised. He enlisted in the Balloon Corps and then was rejected for high blood pressure. So a serio-comic, deflated, whatever. He was not driving an ambulance like E.E. Cummings and so on. No.
We do have a question online which asks, was Jeffers ever recorded reading his own poetry?
Yes, he was in the 1941. The Carmel was extending the sewer lines out to where, sorry, it's true, where Tor House is. And of course, then he had a big sudden tax bill because he had to pay for that, and he didn't have the money. So Una arranged a book tour or reading tour of some Eastern US campuses, and they drove cross country in a whatever it was, a Model T or something, in the middle of the winter to read up and down the Eastern Seaboard to make money. And he was recorded at, I believe it was the Library of Congress. Now, one of the things you'll find if you hear Jeffers reading is that he reads in a very flat monotone. He does not deliver the language on the page. And so you're saying, oh, I'm taking liberties when I try to inflect it. There's another twist to this, though, I think that helps us keep in mind what he was doing. When Jeffers would compose, when he would write, he would walk up and down, pace up and down the attic that went the length of Tor House. He had his desk at one end near the window, walk back and forth until he had the passage in his head. And then he would sit down and he would write it. And if you look at the manuscripts of the narrative poems, the handwritten drafts, you can actually say, oh, there's where he stopped and sat down and wrote. You can tell. So there's a cadence to it that comes from, not from composing on the page and manipulating words in the way Ezra Pound would do, but in the sense of walking and talking, walking and talking, walking and talking. And there's another piece that I think will amuse you. Una, his wife, who tried to keep him on task, would be sitting underneath where he would write. And if she didn't hear him walk, or if she didn't hear him walking, because she knew how long it took him just to copy out what he'd just, been pacing. She had a broom, and she'd pound the floor, which, the ceiling, which was the floor under his feet, and she would yell, "Pace, Robin, pace," until he got up and kept going. So I do think there is the poems themselves show a very real sense of cadence and inflection. And that's a major part of the artistry of his verse, even if he doesn't very adequately portray it in his own reading.
I really want to end on that fun little anecdote, but there is one last question. Someone mentioned that you related, which poem did you relate to Jeffers' cosmology?
Continent's End. Continent's End, which is actually the poem that the Book Club of California used as the title poem for that anthology. It's one of the ones he submitted.
Right here.
It-
Pick anthology.
Yeah, I have my own copy. I found a copy of it. Yeah, no, I know. It's a very interesting volume because many of the poets who are in it are names you would not hear of, but they are a cross-section of the literary life of California at that moment. And just by chance, somebody knew George Sterling and said, hey, you ought to ask this dude for some poems. And they did, and that's where it went.
And there is one last comment from Helen on here that says Jeffers sent a recording to Occidental College in place of him attending a celebration.
Oh, okay, okay.
So if you're out there on Zoom and you want to get a recording of him, you can get that recording or track down that recording at Occidental College.
Oh, well, thank you. I wasn't aware of that one.
So,
His alma mater, by the way.
Yes, his undergraduate, he did his undergraduate work at Occidental. He started at the University of Pittsburgh, graduated from Occidental and did graduate work in literature and medicine at USC and graduate work in forestry at the University of Washington. His father was a theologian who he says slapped Latin and Greek into me as a boy. And he had a command of contemporary or modern European languages and ancient languages that Ezra Pound wishes he had.
okay, we'll take one last question here and then we'll wrap up in the back.
Yes, sir.
With regards to the Great War and the
Yeah.
violence of the war, did Jefferson write in time on World War II?
Oh.
The Great War.
Oh, God, yes.
Can of worms.
No, well, I mean, yes, those poems come out in a collection called The Double Axe. And his reaction to World War II is, if anything, even more intense and problematic. Because in effect, out of World War I, he thinks, I've come to a vision which, if I'm only strong enough, will suffice for me. And then World War II comes along and he discovers, uh-oh, it isn't sufficing. And there's a very, very deep and intense despair. And the very first version of that collection that he organizes, he takes the short poems that he was writing as the war is progressing, and he puts them they're in chronological order, and he labels the section Mornings in Hell. Now, after the war, he then recovers some of his equilibrium, and that's when he comes up with this term inhumanism, which he characterizes not as a philosophy, but as a philosophical attitude. And then that's sort of expanded in one of the two long poems in that collection, which is called The Inhumanist. If you're interested, I can give you some links that lead to some material where you can see how he struggled to put that volume together. The two collections that he had the most difficulty structuring were Tamar and The Double Axe, the two war poems. And there's the tension between the experience that he had as he was writing the poems and what he was trying to make out of the poems conceptually, and how to get those into balance. That was the struggle. Okay.
We might need to have you back to come talk about that,
Yes.
part two, for a second talk.
That's good.
So please join me in thanking our speaker tonight, Tim Hunt.